Night Shift Whispers.
The sky was painted in shades of gray, a perfect backdrop for a gentle rain dance. Each raindrop that fell to the street seemed to twirl with brilliance. The scent of damp earth seeped into the hearts of those who had longed for the presence of rain. I, an 8-year-old at the time, along with my friend Julie, leaped with joy on the rain-filled streets in our housing complex. Our delight matched the bright yellow raincoats we wore, resembling duckling feathers. The radiant smiles on our faces were captured by the sky through flashes of lightning from above. The sound of millions of raindrops falling in a joyful cascade onto everything in the small suburban town harmonized with our laughter. We reveled in every precious moment as it unfolded, before a strange incident turned the situation from cheerful to mysterious and eerie. Out of nowhere, Miss Heather suddenly appeared nearby. She was a single woman in her 60s who lived in our neighborhood. She was friendly and often shared candy with the kids who played in her flower-filled yard. Our mothers were quite close and good friends with her. Miss Heather passed by us, carrying a black umbrella and a wicker basket. She said she was going to the store in the next block and invited us to join her so she could buy us delicious treats. Imagining the delicious pastries sold at the store, Julie and I were instantly tempted by the offer. Besides, we knew Miss Heather well, and our parents wouldn't mind us going with her to the store, which was less than 300 meters from our home. Without feeling the need to say goodbye to our mothers, we immediately joined Miss Heather on the trip to the store. The street was deserted at the time, with no one or vehicles in sight. As we ventured further away from our home, the rain intensified. Fog started to envelop us, becoming denser, and our visibility was limited to less than 10 meters. Beyond that, all we could see was a thick, gray mist. After a few minutes of walking, we finally spotted a building in the distance with warm yellow lights shining from within. It was in stark contrast to everything else, which was enveloped in gray mist. It struck me as odd because the store was not the only building in this neighborhood. There were other stores and houses next to it. Yet, why was the light from the store the only one visible? Even the silhouettes of the other buildings in the vicinity were not visible, barely a faint outline. The store had become the sole object we could perceive amidst the inexplicable fog. Upon arriving at the store, Miss Heather pushed the glass door and invited us inside. As my first step led me into the building, the thicker mist enveloped me. I couldn't see anything, including Miss Heather and Julie, who should have been very close. I moved forward by feeling my way. Strangely, I couldn't find anything to touch. It was as if I had entered a vast, empty space. Miss Heather. Julie. I called out, but all that answered was the echo of my own voice. I began to feel frightened. I called out to them both even louder, but once again, only the echo of my own voice followed. It almost seemed to be mocking me. Somehow, judging by the way the sound echoed, it felt like I was in a long corridor. How could that be? This was clearly a store no larger than my house, and it was filled with merchandise. It made no sense for the sound to bounce back like this. After a few minutes of being lost in the endless fog, I was becoming frustrated and desperate. I had gone in every direction, but I had never reached any kind of exit, only continued to wander aimlessly in the foggy maze. In my troubled mind, I knelt down, covering my face with my hands and thinking. An idea crossed my mind. I had to go back the way I came. Yes, I had to turn around and run back. At some point, I would collide with the entrance or, at the very least, a wall or a shelf of merchandise. That's when I could feel around to find the door handle. I quickly stood up and turned around, then started running. I ran as fast as I could. 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters, 4 meters, 5 meters. I didn't stop running. But strangely, even though I felt like I had covered dozens of meters, why had I not run into anything? It was as though I was trapped in an infinite, wall-less, boundless space. I grew incredibly frustrated. I shouted, calling for my mother, and began to cry. I didn't care if the echoing voice continued to taunt me. I kept shouting for my mother in my desperate sobs. Then, after what felt like an eternity, something hard tripped my foot. My body stumbled, then fell flat. That's when a bright light replaced the foggy darkness. I tried to get up and found myself on the sidewalk, in front of a neighbor's house just 4 doors down from my own. At that moment, the rain had dwindled to a light drizzle. Ignoring the pain from my fall, I ran home immediately. I shouted for my mother from the front gate of our yard. Eventually, I found her sitting on the back porch, drinking tea with someone. However, I was confused because that someone was Miss Heather. I stood there, bewildered and confused. My mother asked me what had happened, and I immediately asked Miss Heather about Julie. Julie? Miss Heather asked in confusion. You were playing in the rain with her on the street. Why are you asking me about Julie? She continued. My mother confirmed this. Since before the heavy rain, they had been sitting and chatting, not moving from the back porch, and certainly not seeing Julie. Panic overcame me. I sat down on the porch, crying, and pleaded for help to find Julie. After I eventually recounted what had happened, we, with the help of many people, began to search for Julie in the surrounding area. However, the little girl could not be found. Days passed, and still no sign of Julie. 3 days later, suddenly, cemetery groundskeepers found Julie sitting alone among the gravestones in the middle of the cemetery. She was in a severe state of trauma, only able to cry and unable to speak. Strangely, when the cemetery's CCTV footage was reviewed, there was no footage of Julie entering the cemetery. She appeared inside suddenly, with no clear indication of where she came from. It took months for Julie to recover psychologically. After becoming stable, she finally recounted the strange events of that day. She said that as soon as she entered the store, Miss Heather transformed into a terrifying figure with long, insect-like legs and sharp, pointy arms. She took Julie to a place filled with giant trees, and atop those trees, the bizarre creatures and their kind lived. Their homes were like winding cave passages among the dense branches and giant vines, made of thick foliage intertwined with thin, spiderweb-like strands. They could climb the trees like geckos. The strange creatures intended to adopt Julie as one of their own. They offered various foods, drinks, and toys to entice her, but Julie only cried and cried. All attempts to persuade her to stop crying were in vain. Eventually, the creature grew irritated and gave up, returning Julie to town by placing her randomly in the cemetery. However, according to Julie, she experienced all of this for a brief moment, less than an hour, rather than the 3 days she was missing.